I'd like to thank everyone from wherever you may be calling today to join our webinar on employee engagement in a challenging economy. My name is Louis Mosca, and I am the Director of Sales for Eastern Canada Talent Map, and I'll be your host. And our speaker for today's topic will be Norm Bailey-David. He's our Senior Vice President of Engagement. And then as far as today goes, we've heard a little agenda why our topic is important, the impact on a challenging economy on employee engagement, how most organizations behave and why worry about engagement during a recession, and then the last couple of 10 minutes in each phase, best practices to maintain and improve your engagement during tough economic times, and some time for Q&A at the end. So just a quick brief information talent map by the numbers. We've been in business for over 17 years. Since inception, we've done over 7,000 employee engagement surveys, and we do 500 plus employee engagement surveys annually. And our only focus is employee insights. So engagement, onboarding, entry, 360s, culture surveys, those types of things. At this point, what I'm going to do is bring in Norm to begin our session and the topic and talk about employee engagement in a challenging economy. Norm?
Thank you very much, Louis. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, to whichever time zone you might be in. Why the topic? I think some of you, it's really interesting across the country in terms of, I've lived through a number of recessions, probably won't tell you all the recessions that I've lived through, but definitely more than 2 or 3. So that just gives you an idea of how I've seen the economic cycle work. And I think what's different this time around is it's so different across the country. Obviously, if you're sitting in Alberta or in Saskatchewan or perhaps in Newfoundland, one of our energy providing provinces, you're feeling this a lot more than if we're sitting here in Ontario or maybe even in Quebec, where things are actually picking up in terms of the economy. So this one is really different for that reason. It really is different across the country. But nonetheless, the reason when I pick a topic for the webinar, what I do is I really respond to a lot of the questions that I get from our clients. And of course, the topic du jour, if you want, especially in some of the western provinces, the energy provinces that I mentioned, and even to an extent here in Ontario or in Quebec, is, why is it that organizations react a certain way and do certain things in employee engagement that really are counterintuitive? And that really is the issue, is that each and every recession that we seem to go through, employers or organizations are always doing the wrong things with regards to engagement. And what I want to do with you this afternoon or this morning is really explore that a little bit. Why are organizations, why do they behave in a certain way? And of course, talk about what some of the best practice organizations are doing even in recessionary times, even with the environment being as difficult as it is. So let me talk about things that I think will come very, very naturally, that for many of you is second nature, but it helps to provide some context before we get into that discussion around best practices. So the first thing that we need to see is every time we see a recession, whether it's the current recession in the western provinces, whether it's the 09 recession, whether it's the 01-02 recession, we always see from some quarters and in the media, especially from academics and from consultants, the need to keep investing. Everybody's writing about, yes, we need to think about the long term. We need to keep our employees because the recession is going to end eventually. We always need to have that long-term view, and those who have the short-term view are going to suffer in the long run. Well, anybody, and I've owned a business. I ran my own company for about 10 years a few years ago, and anybody who's on the other end of that is working in business. If you're a manager, if you're an HR manager, if you're a business owner, if you're in the C-suite, wherever you are on the business side, that really doesn't strike to our reality. The reality that we feel and we live is there is no long term. It's useless to think about a long term if we don't get through the short term. And anybody who's responsible for any business or part of a business understands that very, very well. So thinking about the long term is it really is, pardon the pun, very academic to us that are working in business and are living the recession, right up close and personal. The reality is costs need to be cut. Revenues are down because the market has contracted. Costs need to be cut. And in many, many organizations, especially the ones we deal with, which are primarily knowledge-based and people-based organizations, your major cost base is employees, is staff. And so to cut costs, people have to lose jobs. That's just the reality. So that really, thinking about the long term and investing in people and doing all those good things is good in theory, but in actual fact, we need to make those adjustments for, to compensate for the revenues. Otherwise, the alternative is bankruptcy, going out of business, and none of us want that. So essentially, that's where we need to come from. We need to accept that reality. Yes, it's a harsh reality, but thinking about the long term is cold comfort for those who need to survive in the short term. One of the things about employee engagement is that we're about 18 months into the sluggish or declining economy. 18 months, almost 2 years now. It'll be June since the oil prices crashed, June 2014, when the oil prices crashed. And essentially what we know about employee engagement is that it tends to be a lagging indicator. In other words, the economy contracts. Jobs get lost, but engagement doesn't go down at the same time. What happens is engagement lags that. It follows that. And I think that if you look at this is a chart from Aon Hewitt. It looks at global GDP and global engagement, very, very macro, but nonetheless conveys the point that if we're at the sort of the base of the recession or of the cost cutting now, what we can expect is, unless we manage engagement differently, then we can expect that engagement is going to get worse from here on in. It's not going to be the same, or it hasn't already shrunk to the extent that it's going to. So important to realize that now, and I think the timing of this webinar is particularly bent on that, is now is the time that we can alter that future if we manage engagement properly in that cost-cutting environment. Nobody's going back to, yes, let's invest in our people and spend all that money that we don't have. We don't. That's not what I'm going to be advocating here. What I'm going to be saying is we still have a chance to reverse the trend in terms of lowering or dropping engagement. So obviously, I think a lot of people are well aware in terms of what changes during a recession. What is in the employee environment that's different? Obviously, there's cost cutting, fewer resources, layoffs. That's what's going on. However, I think what we also forget about are the remaining employees, and I think this is where the level of emphasis and what's going to be the undertone of a lot of my discussion here is, what about the people who stay? We focus a lot of time on the people who leave, but what about the people who stay? And the people who stay, essentially, those are the folks that are going to be engaged or not. And those remaining employees need to do more with less. There's increased stress as a result. And obviously, the ones who stay are still worried about their jobs, so they're insecure about their jobs. But what we also don't think about as much, we might think about their job insecurity, but we don't think about how they feel about their departed colleagues. And a lot of the time, there's guilt involved, there's sympathy involved, there's a willingness to keep tabs, and there's a reaction against the organization for having fired my friend, for having laid off my colleague, for having dumped the work on me. So there's that increased workload as well. And all of these things are happening to the employees who stay. Fundamentally, when this is going on, we look at the engagement question as, people are reevaluating that question around, does my organization care about me? And when those of you who have worked with Talent Map in the past, and having looked at the list of those of you who are online, that's quite a few of you, you might recognize this next slide here. I'm not going to go through what is employee engagement. I'm going to take that as a given. But those of you who are familiar with this slide and my presentations around that know that a lot of employee engagement is around the rational and the emotional side. So what's happening when recessionary times hit? We start to cut costs, we lay people off, and the questions that employees are asking about the organization are different, or at least different in emphasis. So on the rational side, we normally, in normal times, we're asking ourselves, yeah, are we getting compensated? Well, is this good for my career? What are my growth prospects? But the question now becomes, is my job secure? And that foundation now is becoming shaky. That rational decision, that rational part of the equation is all around job security as opposed to some of the other things. More importantly, I think, is around the emotional side. And the emotional side, as you know, or as some of you know, when we talk about the emotional side, there's a mutual caring that's necessary for engagement to take place. The employee is asking themselves, does the organization care about me? And if the answer is yes, then fundamentally what's happening is there's a mutual caring involved. Well, what happens in a recessionary situation when we have layoffs is we're reevaluating that. Does the organization care about me? That becomes much more prevalent, and the answers are a lot less certain. And that really is taking its toll, you know, on employee engagement. And the fallacy would be to think that in sort of that distribution of our employees, where we have, let's say, roughly 60 to 70% of our employees tend to be engaged, roughly 20% tend to be in the middle or neutral, and the remainder being disengaged. Everybody in the organization is asking these same questions. So even the most highly engaged, or who were the most highly engaged, can't help but reevaluate under those conditions. And that's what really makes employee engagement a risk when we're talking about a recessionary period. The other thing here is we also see where people feel more secure. And now if you're in the public sector, for example, or if you're in more job stability or stable organizations, or if we're in a region here which is less affected by some of those job cuts, cost cuts, and layoffs, then essentially you get the hunker down phenomenon, where you get some of those people who are disengaged, essentially not looking as much to the market in terms of leaving an organization where they're dissatisfied. And of course, if they're disengaged with the present organization and they stay, well, that's creating an additional, it does two things. It creates additional drag on the organization, but it also creates pressures in terms of not being able to hire or replace with more engaged individuals. So we have a double whammy. Not only do some of our folks are asking and questioning whether or not their job is secure and whether or not the organization cares about them putting their own engagement in doubt, but the folks who have already come to a negative conclusion on those and other issues and are dissatisfied aren't leaving. So they're not exhibiting that discretionary effort so necessary and such a positive outcome of engagement, but they're placing a drag on the organization. So retention is increasing for the wrong reason. So if we look a little bit at psychology, some of you, this will be second nature, but we can essentially look at employee engagement very similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what you see on the screen essentially is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Essentially, it's 5 needs, starting from survival and security. So the most basic needs need to be met first, and then once those basic needs, as our needs are met in each of these slices of the pyramid, starting from bottom to top, then we're going to become more and more engaged, more and more motivated. So as I was saying before, even if we are at the top, our survival, security, and belonging needs are met by the organization, or were met by the organization, and we're very, very motivated and engaged at the top, once those layoffs start to hit, once those cost-cutting starts, everybody reverts back. And we're asking the questions again around the survival and the security. So if we're doing that, if we're back at the bottom of the pyramid, even though we were very, very highly engaged to begin with, we're starting again from the bottom. So of course, that's putting everything into doubt. So when we look specifically at employee engagement, and we look at those things that drive, so if Maslow's hierarchy of needs is here, starting with survival, here we're talking about management, then we're talking about some of the basic security and survival instincts, but what's not on this chart essentially is, and it overshadows everything else, it's all around job security and survival. So even the most engaged of our employees are re-questioning. So this is, I think, pretty second nature to most people. I think it's very, very intuitive. The question now becomes how most organizations are behaving as a result of this and why they're behaving that way. And unfortunately, it's not the way that they probably should be behaving. So let's talk about first, what are they doing and why are they doing it? And then we'll get into what they should be doing or what you should be doing in terms of your organization. So essentially what we see, and we see it up close, and we see it very, very much more often now when we're talking especially to organizations that are hit by this. What many organizations are doing? Well, first of all, layoffs are impediment, cost cutting, none of this is good news to employees. And so the instinct of management, the instinct of boards, the instinct of leaders is to hide the bad news. Nobody wants to be upfront, open, transparent, and purvey the bad news. The instinct is to really turtle and to hide the bad news as much as we possibly can until the last second. Why do organizations do this? Well, there's two fundamental reasons. There's a third one which really relates to we just don't like giving bad news, first of all, so we procrastinate. But more importantly and more rationally, what's happening is we hide the bad news because we're afraid of the rumors and the leaks that's going to happen. So obviously, if we see layoffs, we see pending layoffs, then everybody gets hush-hush until we try to do that entire organization restructuring, figure out who's actually going to be laid off, then we call them into the office and out they go. And of course that bad news hits in the worst possible way. And when you ask organizations why they do it that way, well, there's a number of reasons. There's the security reason. People don't want to get tipped off and then leave with their computers and take a lot of valuable information with them. And there's some merit, of course, to that. But the reason around rumors is actually counterintuitive, because what actually happens with this behavior around hiding bad news is that the rumor mill becomes even more active. And what's more important to understand is the rumor mill is spreading misinformation because there's no fact as the bad news is being hidden. The next thing is we spend much more of our management time restructuring and worrying about the people who are going to leave and the implications to the organization of their leaving and why they do it. Why we do it, it's legal. Obviously, we have to make sure that our legal ducks are in a row. But mostly important is because it's so important and so essentially traumatic to the organization, even to lay people off. We tend to think much and spend much more of our time as managers on managing that layoff and cost-cutting process, and in the process neglect the people who are actually staying to pick up the pieces. And that's purely benign neglect. And if it's benign neglect, then we can take steps to actually change that behavior. And I'm going to get to that in about 5 minutes or so in terms of what the organization should do. The next thing organizations do very, very frequently is training and development costs become discretionary costs. When we're looking at all those line items in terms of what generates revenue and what doesn't generate revenue, look at training and development and professional development, and we look at conferences, and we look at all of those things, and whether it's we in HR or more than likely the finance people will look at that and they'll say, no, this is discretionary, we need to cut this. And of course, when you cut training and development, you're also impacting a major driver of engagement. And you're also sending another clear signal about the job insecurity to folks. So if they don't see their future, which is so important in terms of where we're going with this, and suspending training and development is part of that, then we're actually augmenting the issue. Now, my finance colleagues will be quick to say, yes, but you're the one who said we do need to cut costs, and that's true. The happy medium is to continue with training and development, but like cut off some of the more expensive things like conferences and travel, but augment some of the things that we can do a lot cheaper, things like job shadowing, things like cross-functional training. So we don't suspend training and development writ large, we change its tack. The next thing that happens is we reassign and we change individuals' roles that do more with less phenomenon. So if somebody's department loses 2 people, nobody thinks about reducing their workload as well. So, and this is sort of a fundamental flaw in terms of the restructuring process, is we restructure the number of people, but we don't restructure the amount of work. So if we're contracting as an organization, then we actually have to look at both sides of the equation. And many middle managers refuse to do that because what they don't want is they don't want to show weakness. They don't want to revisit their capacity and say, you know what, with too few resources, I can do so much less. In a job insecure situation, which they are obviously as insecure as many employees, they want to prove to senior management that, well, we can carry the ball here, we can keep going, we can do this, and it's easier to reallocate existing work amongst the other people than it is to reduce. For what happens then is it augments the job stress, and the job stress results in that lack of engagement. We also focus much more on output and production, and we ignore the impact of the economy on the remaining workers. So if you remember a couple of slides ago what I was saying in terms of, you know, folks who stay in the organization, it's not just about reallocating and doing more work and focusing on the output. Those folks are essentially feeling other things as well in terms of what's happened to their colleagues, and you know what's potentially going to happen to them. And we pay little attention as managers to that aspect of the equation, and we focus on producing. And of course, by not attending to some of those softer issues, we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot, because if we were doing it properly and paying close attention to how our employees are feeling about these things, helping coaching them through that, and understanding and empathizing with that, then that would actually augment productivity. And if that, in augmenting the productivity, we're having the positive impact on output and production. So, but many managers don't do this because they don't feel comfortable with doing it. They don't understand or don't want to deal with the psychological side effects of that recessionary environment. And then one of the things that's really, really surprising here, and really is destructive to any organization, is many organizations tend to cut off the laid off workers. Now, there's a big exception in terms of when we're talking about manufacturing, for example, where layoffs tend to follow cycles, like in the automotive industry. People get laid off, but they get called back. So that's the way it happens in manufacturing. But in professional services, and particularly in high knowledge industries, especially in tech, because we're so afraid of the security issues, what tends to happen is we cut these people off, and we lose touch with them, or we encourage losing touch with them. So we basically go to their office or have them come, escort them out of the building for the security reasons that I talked about before, and then we cut them off. So we lose touch with them, and we do that because we're, you know, it's not a priority, you know, keeping touch with those folks, and we're afraid of the security, and we're actually afraid of the drag that we think erroneously that will create by our existing employees maintaining ties. Is they think it's a drag on the organization, and we're not able to move on. Where in actual fact, we know from our own research, as well as academic research, that the laid off workers, if treated properly, and most organizations are pretty fair about this, actually form a huge resource pool. And if done well, we can have an alumni that when the economy does pick up again, we can recruit from that same pool to some extent. So we're looking at a whole series of things, and this is just a few things, a few areas where organizations are really missing the mark in terms of what they're doing in reaction to this recessionary environment. One of the things that I alluded to, and I really wanted to show you a stark contrast here. So when we do an engagement survey, we ask a typical question around information and communications. So take a look at this. It's not, you know, it's on average, communications is not very well seen in any organization, let alone a recessionary one. So we see roughly around 50% when asked about information sharing and whether or not information is communicated well. We ask about, you know, around 50% of people are agreeing to that statement. That's in the green. The blue is the people who neither agree nor disagree, and the orange, which is very, very high in relative terms, you know, 30% are disagreeing with these statements on average. So to begin with, most organizations are not perceived by their employees as doing communications particularly well. And when we look at some of the organizations we've surveyed recently that have had restructuring or layoffs or have had other impacts from the recession, take a look at that. So now what's already not a very, very good situation is infinitely worse, infinitely worse. So what we're looking at here is a situation where employees need, for the most part, the bad news, they need the communications even more than they would in normal times. We're seeing that essentially organizations are not doing that, are not doing it nearly enough. So aside a little bit, I want to talk about, why should we worry about employee engagement? If we're in HR, this is sort of an obvious answer, but when we're in leadership, there's still, and I speak to a lot of leaders very, very often around this particular question, and the response is, well, you know what, they're not going anywhere, they're lucky to have a job. So why should we expend effort and investment on employee engagement when people aren't going to leave anyway? They're going to be, and this is especially true in some public sector organizations that we deal with that have, in good times, have much more difficulty in terms of recruiting and retaining individuals in very strong economies. Now the table is turned and they're having a much better time. Applications are through the roof, retention is high, even amongst those people who don't want to leave. So, why worry about employee engagement? And the short answer is, essentially, the equation has tilted now. So if we look at our engagement model, and so the dimensions that we can control here on the left-hand side, that drives those positive attitudes. And none of the words from the basic model have changed. What I've done here is really bold where the emphasis are. Emphasis is now. So where we're looking at in normal times with resilience, it tends to be that trait, that characteristic, that attitude that is also important to ensure that our employees have. That resilience is what's going to help the folks who stay essentially engage in those engaged behaviors or manifest those engagement behaviors. And those behaviors in a recessionary period when our organization's going through troubled times is going to really, it's going to maintain or improve productivity. It's going to help on the attendance side. It's certainly going to help on retention. And retention, we shouldn't necessarily forget. Even in recessionary times, we want to make sure that our highly engaged and resilient employees stay with us. So now the balance really shifts from some of the emotions around pride and optimism to some of the things like resilience and flexibility. And there's a very, very interesting quote by Gallup, another organization who's very active in the engagement sphere, as some of you know. Why make sure that we deal with employee engagement in harsh times? Well, it helps people be resilient. Businesses right now, when the economy is bad like this, they're trying to survive. And to survive, you've got to have some psychological resilience. You've got to have employees who are positive despite the negative situations around them. So really now what we're doing is we're focusing our dimensions and what we do in terms of management much more in terms of maintaining and augmenting this resilience so that we maintain and augment engagement. It really becomes around this single word, and that's why engagement becomes important. It's important for different reasons, and essentially it's those differences that force us, or that should force us as organizations, to manage this situation differently. So what's going to happen is, where our key drivers were certain things in normal periods, those key drivers are going to change. So essentially now, what should your organizations be looking for? And especially keeping that eye on cost. And I don't want to be utopic around this and say, okay, we got to think about the long term and invest money in training and development despite what's going on, because that's what's good for the long term. Even though that might be true from an academic standpoint, I've already gone through the point that it's just not realistic. Reality bites. Costs are going to be cut as revenues go down. So the thing is, what we need to do is shift the focus. So even if our organization, for years and years and years, we know that what drives our engagement have been things in the past like vision, have been things like innovation, have been things like professional growth. In recessionary times, for all the reasons that I spoke about, the focus on job security, the focus on caring, even amongst our most engaged employees, what's happening is there's a shift. We need to shift focus, and we need to plan much more around those who are staying than those who are leaving. Yes, we need to manage the departures and the restructuring properly, but we cannot lose sight, and in any restructuring discussion, 50% or more of our discussion time should be around what happens to the folks who stay. How do they cope? How do we help them through this? Yes, we have to have the legal discussions to make sure that the departures are managed properly, but we also need, as managers, we need to focus much more of our time on the folks who are going to deal with it, the aftermath. And that's one of the things that organizations consistently have been very, very poor on, at least according to our research, and a lot of academic research. And of course, understanding the priorities have changed, the drivers have changed, as I alluded to before. Whereas we were talking about things like professional growth or innovation in many organizations, it's now around security and survival, and of course building up that resilience. So what are some of the things now that we as organizations should do? Well, it becomes pretty obvious. Promoting security and stability is something that we should do. We have to, when we're thinking about the restructuring, we need to emphasize how individuals' roles are valued and how the people who stay are necessary in the new organization. The second thing is communications. You saw very, very clearly what most organizations are doing. They're hiding information, they're procrastinating, the transparency becomes an issue when in actual fact what's going to help. And this does not cost a dime. It's really focusing on being open, being honest. If we're going to trust the people who stay, and we want them to be resilient, then we have to be transparent with them. We have to have openness, transparency, and be forthcoming on plans and market conditions. We basically need to bring them into the tent and say, listen, this is where we're going. This is what we're doing it. We need your help to keep this going. We know that more layoffs are possible, and that's the case. One of the things that organizations, so many management teams do is they get tight-lipped because, yes, there's one round of layoffs, but they're planning for the next round. They don't know if there's going to be a next round, so they don't want to share this information with folks, especially if more layoffs are possible. Yes, that's going to create some uncertainty, but what supersedes that uncertainty is by valuing the individual roles. And as we value people's roles and we recognize those roles, then there will be some, not perfect job security, but there will be greater job security than if the reverse is true, and we stay tight-lipped. Clear, compelling direction, even if that direction is survival. One of the things, we talk about objectives and vision, but survival can be very, very compelling vision in and of itself. Essentially, and it tends to focus the mind. It tends to focus everywhere. And if they know their role and importance and how that links to that survival, essentially, they're going to be, most people are going to work and become much more engaged in their organization if they do see themselves as part of the future. And the other thing, too, is not to set the sights too far. So we often tend to set the bar in terms of direction as to, okay, well, when oil prices rebound or when it gets better. What we need to be doing is set the milestones a lot shorter, even in terms of quarters. So if we're thinking, if we're thinking about long-term to begin with, the actual reverses, let's get through the next quarter. What do we need to do to get through the next month? What milestone do we need to hit? And in doing those short-term objectives and succeeding with those short-term objectives, that's really going to build a foundation of success that provides the confidence people need, and with that confidence comes the security and stability that we're looking for. A lot of the folks, even though I'm talking to you here as a survivor of many recessions, many folks, many of your employees won't have done this before. And it's really important for those of us who have this experience to coach and mentor our younger colleagues who might be experiencing this for the first time. Because our level of uncertainty is very, very different. We've seen it before. We've seen the oil prices go down. We've seen them come back up. And that level of reassurance is really, really key. And we should, as HR people, we should facilitate conversations between the generations to allow for that. To say, yes, it's going to get better. This is what's going to happen. Don't panic. You know, it does get better over time. We will be here in 2 or 3 years. Oil prices will go up. The economy will get better. As I was saying before, when we talk about training and development, yes, some of those big ticket items might be on the chopping block for obviously good reasons, but we need to improvise in terms of providing. We shouldn't forget about career growth and training. We have to keep convincing people that their future is with the organization, and we can do a lot of things with very low or no cost, like cross-training, job shadowing, and things like that. And that also improves versatility and productivity, by the way. And it helps us, not only helps the employees in terms of their own development, but it helps us as organizations in terms of handling some of the stresses that come with fewer employees. Keep recognizing and rewarding high performance. So, so, so important. We tend to forget about recognition because we're under stress, because we're worried about that next quarter. We need to keep rewarding and recognizing high performance. Those celebratory emails, those pats on the back, all of this is working towards the fostering of that security and stability that someone, if we're recognized for our high performance and our deeds don't go unnoticed, that's going to say, yes, I'm of value to this organization. It's a lot more likely that I'm going to stay than I'm going to have to leave. One of the things that gets chopped are you know, those wellness programs, those the gym memberships and all that thing. Maybe those programs might get cut, but we also need to keep a close eye on what our employees, what our staff are going through. And if we can save the wellness program, or if we can channel some of those issues into other types of lower cost programs, it really is important to acknowledge and help employees to understand and to manage those higher stress levels. Barriers to innovation. We tend to get really, really stuck as organizations and put innovation projects on hold when in actual fact the reverse should happen. So what this actually means is, as resilient employees who really want to help the organization because they feel part of it, are going to have more and more ideas, and we need to channel those ideas and address any barriers to innovation that may have cropped up in terms of, you know, we know what made us successful in the past, so let's keep doing what we're doing because we've always done that. Well, in actual fact, the environment is changing very, very quickly, and more ideas are needed. We need to include and involve and provide mechanisms for doing that even more than we have up till now. And notice I have said there's nothing in here that's necessarily costing us a dime in extra operational outlay. This is all management. This is all things that we can do with time. Of course, time is money in some cases, but it's a lot easier to invest time than it is to invest cash in this type of period. And of course, don't forget about retention. We tend to take retention for granted, but the economy, as we know, those of us who've seen this before, turns on a dime as well. We need to make sure that we keep identifying our high performers and keep doing what we need to do to make sure that they stick with us when that economy turns around, and it is when, it's never if. So essentially, those are some of the things, those are some of the behaviors that organizations, not enough organizations do, and that you should or they should be doing. So on that note, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to check my questions board while Louis takes you through some of the other places that you're going to see Talent Map over the next couple of months. So Louis, if you please.
Thanks, Norm. Okay, quickly, just some upcoming events that Talent Map will be at. We're going to be at the ARMA Spring Workshop. That's actually a trade show, and we'll be exhibiting there, and that's in Niagara Falls on April 13th. We're also going to be at the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, otherwise known as SIOP. That's a spring conference there, April 14th to the 16th, and I believe that's in California. We're also doing some workshop series with the Conference Board of Canada, April 11th, 21st, and May 17th in the various cities there you see, Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver. We'll be at the HRMA conference in Vancouver, BC, April 26th to the 27th. And then our next webinar scheduled for April 28th, as you can see there, and we'll post that on our website as well. And then 2 other events, Ontario Municipal Administrators Association conference, that's from May 11th to the 13th, as well as HRPA Grand Valley in Waterloo. It's a biannual conference, and that's June 22nd.
Thanks, Louis. So while you've been talking, there's been a couple, I've opened up my questions box here, and we see a couple of very, very interesting questions. As Louis mentioned at the top end, the slides will be posted on our website in about a week to 10 days from now, as will the recording of this session. You know, at the end of the last slide, I'll give you some information in terms of a link that if you can copy that down, actually I will move to that slide right now, so you can take note of these links and these email addresses, so you can ask for, if for some reason the website's not, or sort of the webinar is not posted on that link here at the bottom in a couple of days or a few days from now, please don't hesitate to email either Louis or myself. So very, very interesting question here, and I'm not going to reveal the asker, but I will read the question off and provide a little bit of insight on this one. So the question says, as a recently laid off worker from the nonprofit world, your presentation really hit home. Thank you very much. You need buy-in from execs who are true leaders to invest in TalentMap and to invest in the necessary follow-up. Are there key behaviors or leadership traits that you look for to identify a company as one where you can help make a difference? Indeed, there are a couple of key traits. And the first trait in terms of leadership, and I go back to the one slide, is the willingness to be open, transparent, and to communicate. And this is really what separates the wheat from the chaff in terms of organizations. And I can tell in a single conversation whether or not the organization is destined to succeed or is doomed to lower engagement and to you know, subsequent rounds of leaving and to have big retention problems when the recession ends. I'm looking for that willingness to be open, transparent, and to communicate with employees. Once you're in the tent, yes, restructuring is inevitable. The cost cutting has to happen. It's naive of us to think that even the best, the most positive thinking managers, you know, will be able to avoid the layoffs. In a knowledge-based industry, people are the biggest cost. So it goes to follow that some people have to be let go. That's you know, that's the true misfortune of the economic cycle. But the leaders who really care and who essentially are willing to be open, honest, and transparent with their employees in the aftermath of that, and even through that, are the ones that are going to succeed. That's what we really look for when we're looking at this. So the next question is, how do you balance the celebration of success that may be followed by layoffs? Don't these two messages conflict? They do on the surface, but when you think about how this actually rolls out, it makes sense. So the layoffs are going to be temporal in nature. So there's going to be a round of layoffs, let's say, and we hope every time this happens, we hope it's the last time, obviously. But subsequent to a round of layoffs, what we're looking for is to set clear short-term milestones after the fact. So, you know, we want to hit certain targets, we want to do certain things, and when we do those things, and of course, if the layoffs, let's say, happen on March 31st, well, April 31st, May 31st, we're already looking to do certain things, and that's got to be made very, very clear to employees. What are we looking to achieve? Even if it's the most basic, simple things, and as we achieve those little milestones in the short term, we can celebrate that success. Yes, the layoff took place in the past, but the thing is, it took place in the past. We don't forget about the people who were laid off. We maintain contact with them, both formally and informally, but we need to keep celebrating our successes. The next question here, how do you balance the positive, motivating messages that are so critical to employee performance and morale when you know that more layoffs are coming. Again, that's the thing. And I think what the key here is to really trust our employees and to understand that, you know what, folks, we're all adults here. We all can see what's going on out there. We can't give you an ironclad guarantee that there's not going to be more layoffs. There might be, but we need to be, we need to be transparent about it, and we also need to be with the employees affected. As soon as we know the employees are affected, we need to communicate that in an efficient way, not only to the affected employees, but also more importantly to the employees that are staying. And as we're open and transparent about the reasons for those layoffs, then people can move on. And I think that's really the key here, is for the folks who are left, we need to understand what they're going through, have empathy with them for their departed colleagues, but at the same time, we've brought them into the tent, and we make sure that that we maintain that resilience, that all-important resilience. So the next thing here says, excellent ideas and perfectly timed in today's world. Thank you. I think there may be some additional emphasis on the need for open and honest communication with respect to respective unions, who also need to be on board. Any suggestions or ideas for the timing and messaging for unions? Very, very good question. The answer really depends on how good a relationship and how transparent a relationship you have with union leadership. I can't give you a blanket answer to that, because some of our client organizations have very, very strong, very good, very constructive relationships with their unions, and others it's completely combative and destructive. So depending on the situation that you're in, you're going to be wanting to be more or less transparent with the union. That doesn't mean you can be more or less transparent with the employees per se. The union is going to union leadership is going to want to act as a filter. To the extent that we can, we bring them into the tent. And in most cases, union leadership is very cooperative if we're transparent with them. And the cases that's worked very well, the successes that I've seen, and it helps in terms of also developing that trust relationship with the union. But of course, we can't necessarily just invent that. If we're dealing with a very militant, very intransigent union, the tables may be turned. And it really is a case-by-case basis on that. So I think with that, I have answered, oh, there's a couple more here. We still have time for 2 more, so I'll deal with these. We did some restructuring a year ago, first ever 100-year-old company, and employees can't get past it. How do I move these employees forward? It's exhausting. Yes, I can understand that. I definitely empathize. The reason they can't get past it is for the reasons that I was talking about before, is because as a leadership group, as a management group, we've never addressed those issues they have with their departed colleagues. And so rather than try to forget about them, which is our instinct, we want to move on. You want to move past it. It actually helps. It's not only therapeutic, but it's going to help the organization when things do turn around. Hopefully they do turn around. Is if we can essentially reach out to those laid off and create some sort of alumnus or a network of those laid off and past employees, not just their laid off employees, and allow for that interaction, whether it be online. And if we're saying, well, we really don't want to do that, we want the employees to get past it, what you probably don't realize is employees are doing it on their own anyway. If the organization formalizes that and really empathizes with what your employees are going through and facilitates some sort of alumni or alumnus networking scenario, I think everybody would be really on board. Now, of course, I say that in a vacuum. I have no idea what type of company, what kind of environment we're talking about. So the first thing would be to consult that around. Maybe that's not what your employees need. But nonetheless, I think the flip side of that equation is they can't get past it because there's, once you do that once and you lose trust and the communications were done poorly, very, very difficult to regain. So you have to look at that side as well in terms of the openness, honesty, and transparency of the communication. And then the last question we have time to deal with today, and I do believe it is the last question. As an HR, how to orient the employer towards employee engagement when they do know that there is no job outside and thus employees won't leave at any cost? That's a fallacy, by the way. Employees, especially in a recession environment, the labor market has shrunk. So what that actually means is there are jobs out there, but it's a lot more competitive to get those jobs. Who's going to get those jobs? It's not going to be the people who are disengaged. It's going to be the people who are most highly engaged, who are looking for that next opportunity. And more importantly, if they don't see and have that resilience and they don't see that the organization cares about them, then they're actually more likely to jump ship. So retention of those high-performance employees was the last point that I had in terms of how organizations should behave differently. Retention of those employees becomes paramount because in a recessionary period, it's those employees that are actually going to have more likely to leave because the economy doesn't stop; it slows. And as bad as it looks, and of course there's a lot more demand for jobs than there are supply, but there is supply. So the demand and supply meet at our high-performing employees. A lot fewer, and then we're left with those who are dissatisfied, disengaged, and who can't find another job. Nobody's coming to look for those folks. So really, that's where the real fallacy is. We need to pay even more attention to making sure that our high-performance employees, and they will leave if the opportunity is provided to them. So that sense of complacency is extremely dangerous and will burn the organization, if not today, then definitely in tomorrow or the next day. So on that note, folks, I have answered all the questions. I hope you found the preceding hour helpful and insightful. Again, if you want a copy of the presentation and or the recording, please do go to the link at the bottom of your screen in about 5 or 10 days. It will be there. If you have any comments or questions in the interim, please don't hesitate to contact either Louis or myself. Thanks a lot. Have a good day, everybody.